I'll be back.
Well, he told us he'd be back, and here he is with a slew of games both good and bad, and in some cases, really bad. Some franchises find me scraping the bottom of the barrel to even come up with an episode, but the Terminator franchise has received over 40 versions of its games on PC, consoles, and mobile platforms. While today's focus may be one of the greatest movie sequels ever made, how do its video games hold up? I'm Andrew from JoBlo Horror Originals, and come with me if you want to live on today's episode of Playing with Fear. James Cameron's 1984 action horror sci-fi film may have been a nice little success, but T2 Judgment Day was an event. It was released on July 4th weekend in 1991 and would go down as one of the greatest sequels of all time. It was an expensive movie, sure, made for around $100 million, but it would bring back $520 million, and that's just as a movie. The Kenner line of toys, books, comic books, and video games would shoot that number way up. It would get nominated for 6 Academy Awards and take home 4 of them. It would expand further into a theme park attraction that would be a mini quasi-sequel and have a 15-minute longer director's cut that would remaster and recut in some deleted scenes. The biggest change, though, one that works great here but never really translated quite as well in the later sequels, was having the T-800 switch sides to become a good guy. Kyle Reese was long dead at this point, and while Sarah Connor had trained for the eventual Skynet-initiated apocalypse, she had been locked up. T2 changes everything you'd learned from the first movie and throws your expectations right outside the window in the best possible ways, something the games would decide to do immediately after. The first of the games to come out was T2 the arcade game, and it was released on Halloween night of 1991. The game coming out only a few months after the movie is pretty standard, but developer and publisher Midway really chose an interesting route in the type of game they chose. They decided to go the light gun route, and it ended up being one of the greatest light gun games of all time. Light gun technology had been around for some time, with the mechanical gun games using electricity or magnets being around in the early 1900s, and what we know as the light gun games today showing up in the early 70s. T2 would take the success of previous games and add in the soon-to-be ridiculously popular digitized graphics to offer the most complete package yet. Midway developed and published the arcade game, and Midway is no small company. Midway as we know them shuttered in 2010, but they had quite the run with a decent amount of home console games while mostly being known for pinball and arcade machines. They pretty much owned the early 90s with Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. You couldn't go into any arcade without seeing one or both of those machines and their sequels. T2 was a mega hit for them, and it led to those titles. The game puts either 1 or 2 players in the role of an already converted T-800 with the goal of defending and protecting John Connor in the past and battling Skynet in the apocalyptic future. There were digital voice clips from the movie and plenty of digitized graphics.
Fire at will.
The first level is outside in the wastelands, with the Resistance in 2029 trying to fight off Skynet. The second level is inside of a hideout as you try to protect humans and fight off the intruding Terminators. Level 3 is protecting the truck that John Connor is driving on your way to Skynet HQ, while Stage 4 is about destroying Skynet in the present, while also sending a T-800 back in time to protect the teenage John. Level 5 consists of absolutely obliterating Cyberdyne HQ so that all of the research never makes it out of the building, and Level 6 is another vehicle stage where you protect the police van from the T-1000 and his helicopter. Finally, Level 7 really changes things up. Nah, I'm kidding. Same stuff as before, but this time you're trying to destroy the T-1000 first with like nitrogen, and then knocking him into the molten steel. Each level has different settings and obstacles, including just exoskeleton Terminators or fully clothed and skinned ones, ground and air vehicles that Skynet sends out your way, SWAT team members, and Robert Patrick himself for much of the last third of the game. You get power-ups for health and weapon pickups, or ammo pickups that are either in crates or in some cases left on the ground by allies like Sarah Connor. Some of the stages even have bosses that are absolute bullet sponges. This game was designed for you to beat and enjoy it, but not before taking all of mom and dad's change first. Being an arcade quarter muncher is one thing, but how about the home consoles? Surely we would see releases on a few of the big names of the time. Boy, did we get ports and then some. T2 made it to the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, MS-DOS and Amiga, the Sega Master System, and somehow, unbelievably, the Game Boy and Game Gear. Beam Software would develop the game, and it would be published by our friends at LJN. Beam was a short-lived company from the early 80s to the mid-90s that worked on a lot of licensed games in the microcomputer space, with releases ranging from Lord of the Rings to Back to the Future to The Punisher. It's a Game Boy game, but runs well and looks and sounds fun. Looking at the screen with no backlight must have been a chore though in 1991. The Game Gear and Master System ports, which are really the same thing except one's handheld and one's a console, were handled by Probe Software, which was part of Acclaim, and developed by Arena Software, which is what Mirrorsoft used for their Sega games. They did all the Alien 3 games on Sega hardware and would also do the Genesis port of the game. The Genesis and 16-bit competitor SNES ports are the most famous and well-regarded, with their audio clips, speed, and more or less looking and playing the part of the arcade original. All these are available online to try out for yourself, but if you're lucky, you can find one in the wild at an arcade. Be sure to keep a lookout for the pinball machine based on the license too. It's good stuff. However, the best way to play it in its most faithful adaptation is to pick up the 1-Up Arcade Captain for $700. A groundbreaking and fun game, even if light gun shooters aren't quite your style. Over in the, well, you tried department, we would see Terminator 2 Judgment Day released in late 1991 across most of the home computer consoles. It would show its sprites on the Amiga, Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and the ZX Spectrum. No Acorn Electron this time, unfortunately. Come on, modders, do it. The game was made by Dementia Games, who would later change their names to Synthetic Dimensions, and their big claim to fame has to be the home Genesis port of arcade staple Golden Axe. Ocean Software would distribute the title, and they're one of the most famous, and infamous, depending on the quality of the game, distributors and developers in UK history. The computer version of T2 takes a stab at multiple types of gameplay, with several top-down driving sections, several puzzle sections, and a few one-on-one fights that look like a T2 skinned version of Street Fighter 2. Well, the quality's more like Street Fighter 1, unfortunately. At least the levels do a good job of being taken directly from the movie, and depending on what system you had would dictate how well the game played, or even how many levels there were. It's worth a cursory look, but that can be done via long plays on YouTube. I'd say skip this version of the game unless you grew up with it. After the home computers of the day got their shot at the license, it was time for one last release in 1991, with the Game Boy of all consoles getting a crack at it. Developed by Bits Studio, who did a lot of Game Boy conversions for LJN to publish, the game is a short 5-level affair that is what you'd expect of the time. The first 2 levels you play as John Connor in a run-and-gun style until you have to manually reprogram one of the T-800s to send back. This is a nice touch, as it's the only game to show this off. Then you take control of the reprogrammed bot and do a brief driving stage, followed by 2 more run-and-gun stages culminating in the final battle with the T-1000. It has easy-to-use controls, way better music than it should, and does a great job with the property on a black and white, non-backlit 8-bit screen. Next to come out would be the other 8-bit releases of the same title. February of 1992 would see the release on the NES with the Master System, only in the UK, and Game Gear would get out in November and December of 1993. Talk about striking when the iron is hot. These 3 are the same title, with slightly different sounds and looks depending on the console. You play as the T-800 who was sent back during the entire game. No future missions this time around, as you start at the bar and beat up seemingly an entire city as you make your way to a weapon and a vehicle. The following stage is the only variant, as it switches to you and John on a motorcycle trying to fight off and outrun the T-1000 in his truck. You balance shooting him, shooting open gates, and dodging objects. The next 2 levels are saving Sarah from the hospital and destroying Cyberdyne to avoid the creation of Skynet. These 2 levels are maze-like structures that have puzzle solving and objectives to meet during the course of the level, and it's where this version gets a little raw. The final level is in the factory and ends the same way as the other titles, with the melting of both the T-1000 and yourself. All 3 of the games have a surprising amount of cutscenes and feel fast and easy to pick up, at least in the first few and final levels. All these versions were developed by Software Creations, who would later get absorbed and become Acclaim Studios Manchester. Software Creations is probably best known for crushing kids' dreams with bad superhero games in the early 90s. Do you remember Silver Surfer and the Wolverine? Yeah, me too, I'm sorry. The final 2 home console releases came well after the hype had calmed down, with the SNES version being released in September of 1993, and the Genesis counterpart coming out in December. Both were developed by Bits Studios again, and released by either LJN or Flying Edge. Both consoles feature a nearly identical game, with the differences coming from the coloring and sound differences between the 2 consoles. These 2 versions would also expand greatly on the 8-bit model, with the addition of a ton more driving stages, and featuring new side-scrolling sections at the mall, John's foster parents' home, their weapons locker, and the home of Miles Dyson. The game ends as it should, but even after you knock him into the molten steel, you still have to shoot the weird blob monster the T-1000 becomes. The problem is how slow and hard to control it all is. Everything the player character does is slow, delayed, and difficult to pull off. I'd say check out the NES or Master System versions, but the 16-bit generation games are for die-hard Terminators only. Sometimes doing videos like this is just a bunch of pain and disappointment. I so badly want there to be good, fun games on these properties that I love, and a lot of the time I'm just disappointed. However, sometimes you find hidden gems. Sometimes you find stuff so buried that very few people have ever heard of it. Sometimes you find T2 Chess Wars. The game was created by Capstone, which is hilariously billed as the pinnacle of entertainment, when in reality they only had a few games to their name, and only 1 or 2 of those are any good. And by any good, I mean playable. Corridor 7, a space-themed Wolfenstein 3D clone, is probably their best and most well-known work. Chess Wars is one of the many reskinned clones of the famous MS-DOS game Battle Chess, where you get fun animations for every piece when it captures another. This is exactly what you think it is. There's a good guy side and a bad guy side. The good guy side has John on a bike as the bishops, Miles Dyson as the knights, Sarah Connor as the queen, and the T-800 as the king. Then you get the rooks and pawns, who are played by resistance soldiers. On the Skynet side, you have various hunter-killer models as the pawns, rooks, and knights, with a dadbot version of the T-1000 as the bishops, and 2 distinct exoskeleton Terminators as the king and queen. It's fun for a few rounds, but you can do better. It's abandonware and free online, so if you have the itch to see Terminator chess, it's there for you. While T2 is objectively one of the greatest sequels of all time, the games are more of a mixed bag to say the least. There's a great arcade classic, a weird chess game, a few forgettable computer games and side-scrollers, and some decent home ports, but I don't think anything comes close to the Sega CD Terminator 1 game. Check all these out, but your mileage will vary based on how big of a fan of the franchise you are. There are still many more games in the universe, and many more games on sequels still out there. Did you play any more of the obscure entries from today? What's your favorite Terminator game? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you on the next episode of Playing with Fear.